Hello and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at an episode of Weird History where they ask the question, year 536 was the worst year to be alive. What happened? That is the title. Now, my direct memory along this is kind of hazy. The actual image, the thumbnail for it, has an image of Justinian, the emperor at the time. And I know a little bit more that I'm sure they're going to talk about, and I will elaborate then, because I'm currently prepping a college course that I will be teaching. Well, actually, that'll be just making the material for, and then will be taught online through a local college. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to take a look, and we're going to see what we can add to Weird History's content here.
The term worst year ever gets tossed around a lot these days, mostly on the internet, and for reasons like, I was disappointed in the latest Star Wars movie. But scientists and historians have actually argued that no year in the long history of this planet was worse than the year 536.
And here's the reality. That very well may be true. But we have to also recognize the very true reality that, A, it's very subjective. Depending on where you are in the world, the things that are affecting one region are not going to affect somewhere else. At least not in the same way and not in the same manner. So you can have two different regions that have very wildly different worst years. Probably argue that sometime in the 1500s is probably the worst year for native groups here in the Americas. Any number of regions could have different worst years. But that's the reality. It's subjective, and this is where the kind of debate of history comes in, is what can you determine to be worse than something else? Because for some people, one thing may be far outweighing another. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at what they have to suggest that 536 is the worst year ever.
While sure, there have been plenty of worthy contenders for the worst year ever over the course of history, no single year has had more of a measurably bad impact for the decades that followed. Today we're going to explain why the year 536 was the worst year to be alive. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Oh, and leave a comment too, and let us know what piece of history you would like us to explain next. Okay, now let's settle this once and for all. Year 536. Worst year ever.
Alright, let's see what they have to say.
While serving as a military advisor to Belisarius, one of the Byzantine Empire's most distinguished generals, Byzantine historian Procopius noticed some trouble was brewing in the air while traveling with his boss in Sicily in the year 536. He wrote of a sun that gave forth light without brightness, during like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. Translated?
Is that going to be the aftermath of a volcanic eruption? I'm curious. That does feel similar. And given the fact that they specifically showed Justinian in the thumbnail, I'm thinking that a lot of this is probably going to focus on the Byzantine Empire, that eastern stronghold of the Roman Empire that survived well beyond the fall of the West.
It was all dark outside, like all the time. He, of course, wasn't the only one to notice the sun appeared to be in a mood during 536. Michael the Syrian, a Byzantine scribe, would later write of this period, "The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow."
Yeah, this sounds like the aftermath of a major volcanic eruption. The ash being put into the atmosphere itself. Because so far, it doesn't sound like there is a direct fog on the ground. It sounds more akin to that fog being in the atmosphere and preventing sunlight from getting to the Earth's surface, which would imply that a major volcanic eruption put smoke, ash, and volcanic materials into the atmosphere.
Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its full light. The fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. This wishy-washy sun situation cast a non-metaphorical dark cloud over the globe that darkened the sky for at least a full year in 536. Researchers later discovered evidence of a massive volcanic eruption whose ash was likely a major contributor to the Seattle-like weather, minus all the rain, spreading ash and destruction on a global scale. Not to mention it made the grapes sour and the wine bad, so that's an easy strike for the year 536.
I'm curious if you know where that or what volcano that may have been. Please let me know, because I kind of jumped on that idea that it was volcanic ash in the atmosphere, but I have no idea where in the world that would have erupted. I mean, major eruptions can have incredibly far-flung impacts, but that's besides the point for now. Let's see what the next reason why. Because that is particularly bad, because when you get that lack of sunlight, when you get that ash in the atmosphere, it prevents you from getting a solid harvest. It can kill longer lived agricultural crops, things that take and have a longer growing season. It can decimate and can negatively affect those that do grow, which can lead to famine and all sorts of issues if you do not have a proper stockpile of them. Hey!
Basic biology teaches us that plants need the sun to aid in their growth and survival. So not having direct sunlight for the duration of at least a year did a real number on the crop output around the world and sparked a widespread famine around the globe.
Yep.
And it's not just that the plants wanted to catch their rays, it was just too darn chilly for crops to grow. With the sun cloaked in an endless cloud, the temperature of the Earth dropped between 1.6 and 2.5 degrees Celsius,
which is
or 34.88 to
massive
36.5 degrees Fahrenheit for all the Americans thinking that doesn't sound so bad. But it also cooled temperatures for decades to come. Crop scarcities were reported far and wide around this time period, including Ireland, who suffered through their own horrible-sounding food depletion they called bread failure.
All right, now this is the one that I knew that was going to be coming up. The Plague of Justinian. Now, more modern research has actually come around this that directly suggests that the Plague of Justinian is actually a predecessor, an early form of the of the bubonic plague and of the individuals that are eventually going to devastate these regions. Yeah, but as I was saying, there's something interesting about the Justinian plague that happens during this period, in the reality that, as far as we can tell, it is a predecessor to the much more destructive and much more prevalent and deadly bubonic plague later on. It's basically an early form of it.
A dusty veil covering the sun wasn't the only bad thing in the air for these poor people just trying to live their lives in 536. There was also a plague or two waiting in the wings to strike on these vitamin D-deprived immune systems. Nobody
And keep that in mind.
was immune to this infestation. It swept through the lower classes all the way to the imperial palace. Symptoms.
Yeah, but that's a reality. Lack of the vitamins from solar radiation, lack of proper sustenance because of the famine that comes with it. All those things diminish your immune system. So when even a smaller disease arrives, it can be devastating to a population.
As it was lovingly described, began with a sore that formed on the palm of the hand and progressed until the afflicted one could not take a step. The legs swelled, then the buboes burst and pus came out. Obviously, if this same plague were to infect the world today, there would probably be a TV show called Dr. Bubos, Pus Buster, and with it, a new contender for the worst year to be alive. With the plague beginning to make the rounds in Constantinople, the city began to stink, what with the piles of dead, sick bodies just sort of being tossed around into the sea only to resurface later. There wasn't a lot of burial planning going around back then.
Bring out your dead!
It was more of a wing.
Now, the reality is there is plenty of burial planning. They have plenty of rituals, plans, ideas on how to deal with the dead. The problem is when you have a pandemic like this hit, oftentimes the actual death rate far exceeds the current infrastructure to handle that death rate. And so that's probably more why we have the excess of bodies than a set of, say, poor planning.
Vibe around the Justinian plague. Emperor Justinian ordered the bodies to be removed from the city,
I'm not dead. There. He says he's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not.
but all that did was expose more people to the disease, as healthy people were responsible for moving deceased sickly bodies out of the cities. Things weren't all bad for Emperor Justinian, though,
Which
as the
makes
plague
sense.
that took all of these lives and made the city a smelly nightmare would later be named the Plague of Justinian, so that was probably nice for him. Less so for the estimated 50 million people that died from it, however.
That is a wild number that I did not know. Of course, that's not just in Constantinople. That's across Eastern Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, because it likely originated around the eastern side of the Caspian Sea, if my memory serves me correctly.
Around 536, the climate in China started its journey into madness, doing perfectly normal things like raining dust you could scoop into your hands. Not only should it not rain dust, it certainly shouldn't be measurable by the scoopful. The Nan Shi, a 6th century chronicle, reported a yellow ash-like substance falling from the sky. They named their freak weather hui, or dust, and said it was yellow in color. Whether this was volcanic ash or just some random, unexplained climate reaction is not known. However, this was just the beginning of China's climate disruption.
It is likely, given I don't have the full context of the situation, but it is likely that it is a mixture of volcanic ash and snow. We've seen air pollutants like volcanic ash cause things like that. Western Anatolia deals with black snow from the high amounts of coal pollution that gets put into the air from their plants and from their factories. So it can have a very real effect on the regional uh, precipitation. So I'm assuming that it probably does have something directly to do with the volcanic ash that is in the atmosphere and causing these issues.
The chronicles of the southern dynasties reported on a rare summer-winter weather event with frost in the midsummer and snow in August.
Yep.
Like a Southern California girl in Chicago in January, the crops were not here for this cold snap. Summer crops were destroyed, and the city of Xinzhou, along with others, were thrown into a deadly famine that lasted for 2 years and resulted in the deaths of around 70 to 80% of the population.
Yeah, and that's going to happen. A frost like that to unprotected crops will just destroy them overall. This happens more regularly than you might think. The modern system, the modern agricultural system, tends to be robust enough that we don't end up encountering nearly as many famines in developed countries. But this still happens where freak weather events or randomly, or we see massive drops in temperature, just eradicate whole regions worth of crops. And if it doesn't eradicate it, it very much so dramatically impacts it or hurts it. Where I live has seen a pretty low yield for its typical year because of the heavy rainfalls and then the scorching summer. Those are not common things for our area, but those two things in combination, in their kind of uniqueness, has done a large amount of damage to our regional crops.
Researchers discovered evidence deep in the ice sheets of Iceland and Greenland that indicated a major volcanic event occurred around 536. Volcanic eruptions in Iceland in 540 and 547 thrust people into the literal Dark Ages, with ash lining the skies and blocking out the shiny hot sun thing in the sky that the people of the 6th century were starting to get used to having around. Based on a tropical volcanic ash later discovered, some scholars have suggested a volcano in El Salvador went blasting off around the year 535 or 536. Still others pointed to a volcanic eruption in North America as a contributor to the dark skies around the world. When combined with the 2 Icelandic volcano eruptions, it kicked off what was adorably called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. This cute little ice age cooled off the planet for at least a decade and resulted in the death of crops and subsequently people. Both
Yeah, and that's going to happen. It also makes sense that this is a variety of volcanoes. It's rare that you have a singular volcanic eruption that's able to do that amount of ash volume to actually blot out the sun for substantial amounts of time. But if you're talking about four pretty sizable eruptions in a couple year span, that can start building up and create a compounding issue globally. It's also not rare for us to encounter little ice ages. If I were to try to go against the year 536 that they're going with, I'd probably have to put it somewhere in the early 1300s. The early 1300s sees a lot of these same issues. We see the arrival of the Little Ice Age that lasted for more than a decade. We saw the Great Famine across Europe that devastated its wheat crop and thus led to major issues across the continent. We saw issue after issue after issue, and then eventually the bubonic plague, and then this is shortly after the arrival of the Mongols on the eastern side of Europe. It's a devastating period to be alive if you're in Europe specifically.
Directly through starvation and indirectly, a malnourished population was more susceptible to diseases, of which there were plenty running around. Well, there's one thing that certainly couldn't claim it had a bad year: exploding volcanoes. By the time the 6th century rolled around, the Roman Empire had migrated east to Constantinople. And, under the guiding hand of Emperor Justinian, the Romans sought to get back to the glory days of the empire.
Because at this point, the West had already largely fallen apart. You see the new groups moving in and taking territory in Italy.
Much like a high school graduate who still hangs around campus and wears their Letterman jacket. I mean, it is pretty cool. Though some of Justinian's generals saw success in this cool goal, most notable Belisarius, who fought against several different armies, including Goths, Vandals, and others, Justinian himself couldn't mirror the success due to constant uprisings and imperial instability. Those pesky uprisings
there's
always getting in the way of success. To add sickness to war defeats, the Byzantine Empire would never fully recover from the disease and famine sparked by the events of 536. The Byzantine Empire lost between 35 to 55% of their population in the year 541, once the bubonic plague moved in and did what the plague did best: kill depressingly high percentages of entire populations.
Which is incredibly problematic if you're trying to maintain success or maintain civilization. Dramatic population loss like that is A, always tragic, but also B, just structurally unsustainable. So the more death, the higher percentage that you see lost very quickly is the most likely reason why you're going to ultimately fall apart. Now, I want to be very clear here. Rome does not fall in 536. Rome as a general state continues to exist till the mid-1400s. I'd argue that it's not until the fall of Constantinople that we actually see the end of the Roman Empire. But that's beside the point.
Historians believe the plague could have been transported by plague-infested rats hitching a ride on military trains during this attempt to bring the Roman Empire back to its peak, which clearly backfired.
Which I could see. Now, here's another thing that you should it bears reminding. I said at the beginning that usually events that are horrific in one area don't directly affect another. But when you have a global catastrophe like the dramatic amount of ash that's in the atmosphere at this point, limiting the temperature and devastating crops, that's not going to be a localized issue. That's going to become a global issue, and it makes sense that regions around the planet would have this happen.
The horribleness of 536 didn't discriminate. The Moche civilization of Peru wouldn't count 536 as their banner year either. The Moche civilization, a once dominant force in the region, were known to be avid fishermen and developers of an advanced irrigation system that allowed a variety of crops to grow.
Fascinating.
Their agricultural talents were the backbone of their economy, but the weather conditions in the 6th century caused their pocketbooks to take a deep hit. It was around this time that an unusually strong El Niño weather system caused waters to warm, which decimated the fish supply. The freak weather system also caused heavy flooding, which ruined their irrigation systems and devastated their ability to grow enough food to feed their people.
Leading to famine.
People, Probably tired of listening to Twitter users claim X and X was the worst year ever, a group of scholars set out to set the record straight once and for all. Harvard historian Michael McCormick and a group of scholars decided to science their way out of the age-old question, what was the worst year to be alive? Initially, however, this was not the ultimate goal of McCormick and his group of 12 interdisciplinary scholars. The group came together to study metal usage, coinage, and changes to the 7th century monetary systems. Somewhere in this thrilling subject matter, one probably began to ponder if they were living in the worst year to be alive. Their findings included an analysis of volcanic fragments from an Icelandic volcano in ice core samples from Swiss glaciers that, yes, dated back to 536, confirming the volcanic event that thrusted a good portion of the northern hemisphere into unprecedented darkness, setting off a global catastrophe. Yeah, but in 1998, both Armageddon and Deep Impact were released, and people had to choose between which two asteroid-based action movies they liked best. That's a tough year. The Planet Left Behind
So tree rings specifically ebb and flow in their size based on how much they can grow in a year. So a good year, strong with a solid amount of water, not too much, not too little, solid climatic stability, you would see a very thick ring because it would grow more compared to a bad year. If there's a drought, if there are climatic issues, you're going to see that ring be much shorter than any other time. So you can use tree rings as a pretty good way to understand where and how the climate shifts during periods of time and how they adapt to them. That's also quite interesting when it comes to the scholars. You might be asking, like, what does metal usage have to do with this, coinage, things like that? But Europe, for a decent amount of time, ended up dealing with basically a coinage shortage. Eventually, the major mines, or the surface level mines that we could get to without modern technology to go deeper, we started to see that region run out of silver and gold by the earlier thousands, by the early second millennium, second millennium. And this is some of the early pieces. Now, eventually, new gold, new silver would be brought in, primarily from the Mali Empire in Western Africa, through the Saharan highways and sea travel, and from Peru and Western South America after the colonization period in the 1500s. But there's a decent amount of time where coinage becomes kind of difficult to mint and come by, and becomes incredibly inflationary because of it.
Of evidence of climate trauma that resulted in a chain of climate events that spiraled over into real human suffering. Remember, we only get one Earth, everyone. Please recycle. Dendrochronologists, people who study tree rings to determine a tree's age, since that's a science and not a wild guess, noticed some disturbing patterns emerging when examining Icelandic trees. The rings indicated a period when the tree's growth had slowed, suggesting a significant cool-down had occurred around the middle of the 6th century. This, combined with the newly unearthed ice core evidence discovered in 2018, helped date the time of the catastrophic event that ruined Earth for a little bit, to the year 536. In researching for the worst year to be alive, things weren't always so bleak. In fact, the research started by our friends at Harvard ended on a positive note. While the events of 536 were the spark for some truly literal dark days in our planet's history, the researchers were also able to find the moments things really started to turn around. When researching coinage, they noticed the reappearance of lead in the ice core samples, indicating that people were producing silver again for money. Ah, capitalism, the life force of us all. Experts argued the prevalence of silver meant more coins were being produced, which was a sign of a thriving economy. The lesson being, as bad as it may seem, it will almost always get better. Almost always. So what do you think? Would you like to go into a time machine and play the ultimate game of Survivor?
No, thank you. However, that is fascinating. I love that idea of looking back at that. And there are plenty of major issues that you can analyze and break down in 536 and the issues associated. I will see you guys in the next one. On Monday, we're finishing up the Incan Empire. And I'm probably down to 2 videos a week. I just took a secondary job prepping for online college courses and making the lecture videos and structuring for that. Maybe I'll post some of those on here. Who knows? But ultimately, I hope you have a great day. I'll see you in the next one. Let me know what else I should react to. Bye.